Hello, Politics Plus Media 101 listeners. Justin Higgins and I are back at it, and we are here to talk about a story that has shaken the American media. In a big surprise, earlier this week, the PGA Tour announced that they had reached a deal with their erstwhile rival, the LIV Tour, funded by Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund, and they were merging to create a new entity that would be owned really almost entirely by the Saudi Public Investment Fund. This is a story that has really shocked so many people in the American and global media. And it's a fascinating one because it's not just a story about sports. It's also a story that reflects a lot of what's going on in global politics right now, a lot of what's going on in the global economy right now. So, Justin, why don't you tell us a little bit about what happened and what are some of the reactions that we're seeing from the American media?
Yeah, John. So top line is it's been an absolute firestorm. Everybody from your blue collar construction worker, for example, in Boston, to your most elite politician like Josh Hawley have been bashing the PGA Tour. They've been bashing LIV Tour, and they've been bashing the Saudi Arabian government. I think we need some backstory here. And before we start the backstory, why this is important is because for the last 3 or 4 years, the LIV Tour and Saudi Arabia and the PGA Tour and some Americans have been engaged in outright PR campaign warfare. And as a result of the tactics used by the PGA Tour, I will never watch golf again. Just to give a recap, PGA Tour, biggest golf tour in the world, here in America, all the best players play. 2019, allegedly, Saudi Arabia tried to buy the PGA Tour back then. Not confirmed reports. So in lieu of being able to do that, they just sunk, John, billions and billions and billions of dollars into the LIV Tour. I think right now, as of in 2022, they had sunk $2 billion into this damn thing. The end result was this kind of hot war almost between LIV and the PGA Tour for who could survive the longest. And as a result, the PGA Tour, Commissioner Moynihan, decided to go on a negative PR campaign against the country, Saudi Arabia. He basically said that golfers who were jumping ship from the PGA Tour to the LIV Tour were immoral because they are looking past grave human rights violations by the Saudi government, like women's rights issues, LGBTQ issues. There was a whole thing with 9/11. There was much, much more.
Well, I talked to players. I've talked at a player meeting, and I've talked to a number of players individually for a long period of time. And I think you'd have to be living under a rock to not know that there are significant implications. And as it relates to the families of 9/11, I have 2 families that are close to me that lost loved ones. And so my heart goes out to them. And I would ask, any player that has left or any player that would ever consider leaving, have you ever had to apologize for being a member of the PGA Tour?
Ultimately, everybody thought, okay, this guy may have an argument. He may be forthright here with his narratives because it resonates with overwhelming majority of the American populace. And fast forward, John, we find out on June 6th that no, Mr. Moynihan was not acting out of some moral fortitude. No, he was not acting out of the best interest of his golfers, aka his employees, or the impact that the PGA Tour has culturally in the United States. What was he acting in the best interest of? And the answer is simple: lining his own pockets. So that's kind of a recap of where we're at. And the net result, John, is absolute fire and fury from politicians on Capitol Hill. I listen to sports talk radio 8 hours a day. That's a little bit of an exaggeration. But I listen to folks from your neck of the woods in Boston call up about all types of things. Golf is never a focus. Saudi Arabia. They were talking about Saudi Arabia on this sports show the last 2 days. And everybody is just angry. So that's kind of where we're at.
Yeah, Justin, it seems as though this deal, and for the last couple of years, the LIV Tour itself, as it existed before the deal, have been bearing the weight of the entire U.S.-Saudi relationship, and that every issue in the U.S.-Saudi relationship and all of the complicated ways, mostly negative, in which Saudi has perceived the United States are being projected onto this one project. And just like you said, it seemed as though it was also the most that most in the mainstream media had been talking about golf and the sport of golf since the heyday of Tiger Woods. So it really became something that was bigger. The story became something bigger, than any of the different aspects of it are being treated on their own. It's become this is a real fixation and obsession. And like you said, I think that it's revealed things that are not so flattering about the leadership of the PGA Tour. You'll hear people saying that this was the inevitable outcome of the situation, but I think that hindsight always betrays these comments of inevitability. And I would encourage people not to listen to any analysts who claim that outcomes are so inevitable. I think that the deal that was announced was truly shocking, in part for the reasons that you mentioned. The extraordinary accusations and claims that were made by Mr. Monahan in his extensive public campaign against Saudi Arabia and the upstart LIV Tour. He said things about Saudi Arabia and about the LIV Tour that you think would preclude any kind of arrangement. And in a way, it sort of mirrors what's been happening between the principals in the U.S.-Saudi relationship, doesn't it? Because famously on the campaign trail, our now president, Joe Biden, then former Vice President Joe Biden, claimed that he would, in his public policy as president, turn Saudi Arabia into a pariah state. At that point, you think that it might not really be possible for now President Biden and the leadership of Saudi Arabia to ever really get back on the same page. Such an extraordinary shot across the bow, so to speak. But sure enough, the U.S. and Saudi Arabia are back working together again on a lot of important issues. So there is that interesting parallel in the way that Mr. Monahan was talking about Saudi Arabia and the eventual outcome with what's happened at the national level between these two countries.
Khashoggi was in fact murdered and dismembered, and I believe in the order of the Crown Prince. And I would make it very clear, we were not going to in fact sell more weapons to them. We were going to in fact make them pay the price and make them in fact the pariah that they are.
President Biden has a way of just speaking very forcefully on the campaign trail about other countries. I remember he made a big deal of looking into the eyes of Vladimir Putin, and I think he called him a dictator, murderer to his face or something like that. There are other examples of this, so I think it's, the Biden flair.
Of course, any reference to looking into Vladimir Putin's eyes is, of course, a reference to the very poorly aged, very unfortunate quote from George W. Bush. Yeah, he said that he could look into Vladimir Putin's eyes and see his soul, something that was actually mocked pretty soon afterwards by President Bush's own vice president, Dick Cheney, who said, well, I looked into his eyes and I saw a KGB agent.
Mr. Monahan, with all of these comments about moral fortitude, he was strict and strong. And then immediately, once it doesn't serve him to continue that narrative, he flip-flops, kind of like Kevin McCarthy saying the Republicans are the force of law and order. And then immediately when Donald Trump gets indicted, he comes out defending Trump and decrying the lack of rule of law in the United States. Just completely made up lies. But John, why this is interesting to the American listener here and me personally, right? Because I look at a lot of things through a political spectrum, is we recently pulled out from Afghanistan. So we're going to have to work with Saudi Arabia, a major player in the region, not only for our own national security, but for global stability. You had mentioned that there was a spat in November. Gas prices will be a massive topic and focus going into the 2024 presidential election. Also, lastly, I think that what they're trying to do symbolizes a lot of maybe a progressive nature, right? Where they are trying to transition from being a petrostate into a new type of economy. And the mechanics of it are just fascinating. So you're the expert here on this. Can you get into the PIF? I know the way that I imagine it is it's just this massive fund of money created by oil that Saudi Arabia is spending.
Yeah, well, first I want to say I disagree that the withdrawal from Afghanistan is a big factor in U.S.-Saudi relations. What I think has really changed the way the U.S. and Saudi are interacting has been the escalation in Ukraine. The enormous full-scale invasion that was launched by the Kremlin and Russia into Ukraine in February of last year. I think that was really the moment that changed the U.S.-Saudi dynamic enormously. I think that at that point, the U.S. became really focused on trying to rally global leadership around the Ukrainian cause and looking not only to democracies, as President Biden had initially insisted that he would orient his foreign policy around, but to all manner of partners that we've got around the world. It also made the energy exports, as you alluded to, a really important factor, because when the U.S. and our European partners began these sectoral sanctions against the Russian energy exports, it needed to be replaced by exports from elsewhere. And the Arab Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia, are an enormously important source of oil and gas to the global economy. And I think, just like you mentioned, last year there was a big dispute over prices because the USA and Saudi Arabia were looking at the issue very differently. The way that Saudi Arabia thinks about the oil price is very tied into everything that's been going on with the PGA and LIV Tour. It's the vision that the Saudis have for the future of their economy. That's really what's behind so much of this and so much of what's been happening the last few years in Saudi Arabia and the Arab Gulf, broadly speaking. So we're in a phase now, as we all know, where the world is trying to prepare for a post-fossil fuel future, where alternative fuels are becoming more significant, where global action against climate change is becoming an increasing focus of so many of the major countries and economies, and where often the actual reserves of fossil fuels are themselves coming into question. We've been through a few different price shocks in the last few years, the COVID pandemic probably being the most extraordinary, where the oil price actually went negative and oil producers had to pay to have their oil stored rather than selling it at the high prices that we were used to a few years before. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, other major petroleum exporters are thinking a lot about what the future of their economies are going to look like after fossil fuels have had their time at the center of the global economy as the lifeblood of the global economy. And this enormous source of money that these states have gotten from exporting fossil fuels have been the source of regime stability in these states, because the resource wealth that the countries have cultivated have funded their generous welfare states, have funded their significant construction projects, have funded their enormous investment in national security and defense. They've broadly kept the populace happy, or at least prevented the populace from the level of discontent that would lead to some kind of revolution. These states are monarchies. They're very concerned about maintaining the persistence of their monarchies, especially after the Arab Spring events of 2011. So the post-fossil fuel future looks scary, and the countries are trying as hard as they can now to really focus on that economic future and prepare for it.
John, as a result of court documents that just became public, it's known that Saudi Arabia invested over $2 billion in the LIV Golf Tour without receiving any revenue. And additionally, they recently spent up to 100 million euros for Karim Benzema, one of the best soccer players in the world, to go leave his team and move to a team in Saudi Arabia. I can't imagine. I know for a fact the PGA Tour is not going to be a pillar of the Saudi Arabian economy moving forward. There has to be some soft power play at heart here, and it's not just dollar and cents, right?
There's a very broadly recognized need for countries like Saudi Arabia to invest in new ambitions, new initiatives to prepare for the post-fossil fuel future. The year that they're looking at in particular is 2030. And a lot of these kinds of investment projects are part of the broader agenda, the broader umbrella that's called Vision 2030. And a sovereign wealth fund like Public Investment Fund, the PIF, is a big part of this. It's a big investment vehicle for these kinds of projects. So it's widely recognized that this kind of investing needs to happen. But there's also questions around the execution, aren't there? And not all of these investment initiatives are created equal. Some of them seem to have good commercial sense behind them, and some of them really don't. And I think there's a big contrast between the Saudi Pro League and the new investment that's going into the Saudi Pro League. That's the football league that Karim Benzema is going to be joining, that N'Golo Kante is going to be joining, that Cristiano Ronaldo is already a part of. That there's a real domestic audience for that. There's a real domestic football industry. There's going to be real benefits in the public morale and the public support for the vision as a consequence of that. And then something like the LIV Tour, which seems to have almost no domestic benefit and has almost no commercial sense behind it, and was incredibly poorly executed from a management perspective. So you really have to wonder, why on earth were Saudi Arabia putting so much money into this ridiculous project of the LIV Tour rather than something like the Saudi Pro League that has a real sense behind it? And, you know, I've read various things about this. You alluded to the idea that their ambition was not really to make a success out of the LIV Tour in the first place, but just to find a way to do what they may have eventually done, which is take over most of the PGA Tour itself. I've also heard that the key governor of the Public Investment Fund's board, Yasser Al-Rumayyan, is himself a fanatical golf fan. And and that a lot of the interest of the PIF in the LIV Tour concept was really a consequence of his own personal interest in the sport. And I think that kind of reflects some of how the economic investment in this part of the world does unfortunately operate. You know, we talked about how Saudi Arabia is a monarchy and many of its neighbors are also monarchies. You know, we understand sometimes the benefits of a monarchy where you have a succession plan built into the system, how there's sometimes a traditionally based legitimacy that comes out of a monarchy. Like we see that reflected in the UK as well as in the Arab world. But there's also pitfalls. You're putting a lot on the principles in your monarchy. And what if you end up with Caligula instead of Augustus as the monarch at a given time? Sometimes the whims of the individual people who have so much importance in an absolute monarchy like Saudi Arabia can dictate the country's decisions in a way that's unfortunate. And we can see how perhaps the predilection of this particular person as an enormous golf fan has really steered them in a direction that should not otherwise be justified.
It's rather fascinating because the coverage in the United States from the sports talk hosts to I don't even know what you characterize Ben Collins, your internet reporters, to your hard politics anchors and reporters like Caitlin Collins has largely been focused on Saudi Arabia purchasing the PGA Tour to gain influence in the United States and to sports wash, which is to kind of whitewash, for lack of a better term, to obscure their image of repression, of brutality, of a lack of human rights across the board. And through partnering with the PGA Tour, which is strong in America, they can change how they are perceived around the world and in America. And for me, the interesting part here is, at least from the PGA-LIV Tour perspective, we've already mentioned how LIV Tour made them no money. It doesn't make sense financially. I think there's a legitimate chance for this deal to fall through. So in the United States, we have antitrust laws, right? You can't be an industry that just buys out all of your competitors to have no competitors. One of the very few exceptions is Major League Baseball. They are literally exempt from antitrust law. It's been that way since 1922. What does an antitrust exemption allow for? I think that this is very interesting because if the PGA Tour had this exemption, a lot of the headache that I think that will be caused from this merger and Saudi Arabia buying the league essentially would be avoided. But Major League Baseball's antitrust exemption empowers the league and its clubs to conspire in ways that are against the law, quite frankly. The current version allows for Major League Baseball can cap salaries of their players. They can deny opportunities for clubs or organizations within their network to move to larger markets. And they can basically control and pool intellectual property rights, which is all highly illegal for other organizations. Now, because the PGA Tour doesn't have this protection, because Saudi Arabia is a lightning rod for a lot of American politicians. For example, Senator Tim Kaine said the deal between Saudi Arabia and the PGA Tour makes him, quote, want to vomit, end quote. What we're going to have happen here is the deal could fall through, very well could fall through. Concurrently, there are going to be massive congressional investigations. We've already had Senator Richard Blumenthal call for these investigations, and also Senator Ron Wyden, who's the chairman of the Finance Committee. Why does this matter? If you are indeed trying to sports wash, which many countries do, it's nothing out of the norm. It's an example of soft power. It's an example of wielding your money from the PIF in this instance to further your geopolitical objectives, really. Then you want positive coverage. But the initial coverage of the deal has been extremely negative, in large part because of the PGA and their PR campaign. The future coverage of the deal is also going to be extremely negative, John, because we all know that congressional investigations, for the most part, are these contrived events where you either are in favor of the people testifying or you're against the people testifying. If you're the chairman of the committee and you're against the people testifying, you are going to stack the deck with questions, with points, with just grandstanding in a way that points out all of the faults of the person or entity that is testifying so that they can be then clipped, shared on Twitter, Facebook, social media, and basically go viral and earned a ton of earned media from this moment. So that is all to say, why is this important that PGA Tour doesn't have antitrust, that the Saudi Arabia PGA Tour haven't thought through their deal, and it may be a pet project of one of the governors of the PIF? It's because ultimately the net coverage is going to be extremely negative, and it could undermine and further entrench negative sentiment of American citizens against the kingdom.
Justin, part of why I'm skeptical myself that this is all going to work out in the end is because I've seen this movie before. I have a bit of experience working in Arab Gulf states on media and entertainment projects that are the consequence of, sovereign wealth fund investment. And I've noticed patterns. And the pattern that I'm in particular thinking of is the boom and bust cycles that we go through in that part of the world. And the amount of money that seems to be available for these sorts of things, as we've been describing, is very connected to commodities prices. At a time when the oil price is high, everything seems wonderful. And there's so much room for silly spending. There's silly money. It gets put into many silly projects, as well as some very good ones. But the real hard commercial concerns are not always being adhered to in those moments. The right questions aren't always being asked and answered. And then you have the bust, when the oil price goes down and all of a sudden the economy massively contracts and there's no more silly money to spend. This happened around 2014, 2015 when the oil price was getting very low. It happened again in 2020 when the oil price got very low around the time of COVID. You either have all the money in the world or you have none. And at the times when you have all the money in the world, you put money into things like the LIV Tour. We have talked about how shambolic this project was managed, but we didn't go into very much detail. So I would like to paint a little bit of a picture for everyone listening here. This was a new sports league that offered $100 and sometimes $200 million to aging former stars like Phil Mickelson to come and defect from the PGA Tour. They launched their big sporting league without a single television deal and without a single sponsor. Zero revenue, $200 million for one player. This doesn't sound like a business case that you would make to any investor other than the public investment fund. Also, the tour, the public investment fund, they got an assessment from McKinsey, who famously sell a bill of goods to many sovereign wealth funds in the Gulf Fund on these kinds of projects. But they got an investment from McKinsey on what the tour would need to be successful, to get commercially sustainable. And a year in, they were missing in every single target that had been identified by McKinsey. The chief operating officer of the tour, who was seen broadly outside the tour as being the smart guy who could do the management, who had a lot of experience in the business of sport, a guy called Atul Khosla. He used to work for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers NFL team. 1 year in, he was fired, dismissed, quit. He left the project. A big hit to the project. The brains remaining, the brain trust of this tour, were Mr. Al Ramayan and Greg Norman, a widely reviled former golf star who, even after this new rescue that the PGA have gone to, might not actually be able to come back into the good graces of the rest of the golf world after this experience. I mean, it's hard to imagine a project being run worse, but they seem to somehow have come out okay. And I think that what it reminds us is that when you do have a well of power and financing, you can sometimes survive some big mistakes. There's room for error.
Well, it reminds me of the United States in some type of way, right? We have been, at least when we were younger, 2 decades ago, we embarked on a lot of silly, foolhardy, downright dangerous foreign policy initiatives, spending trillions of dollars. Yet we're still, many would argue, the leading power in the world, if not a true hegemon anymore. And that's because, obviously, military power, but it stems from our wealth. And I think it covers up a lot of bad decisions, right?
When you have a base of power, you can swallow mistakes and you can make bad decisions and survive a lot easier than someone smaller can do. You have a lot more maneuvering space, a lot more room for error. And the United States, like you said, have committed some big mistakes, like the invasion of Iraq, something that would destroy a smaller power. A smaller country could not make a mistake like that and turn out okay. This is also reflected in the world of business. We've seen major companies have big flops and still be okay. You know, like Google, when they introduced something like the Google Glass, certain Apple products, you launch a product that's that big of a failure. Disney, some of the movies that they've released that have been, I'm thinking of John Carter of Mars, losing $200 million, and they maintain their status at the top of the industry. That's kind of what we're seeing here with the PIF and LIV, where they sunk so much money into what was obviously a failing project and have turned out fine because they have enough resources that they can make these kinds of mistakes and still maintain their position. And I think that what we learned was that the PGA Tour itself, wasn't as well resourced as we probably thought. And for them, the opportunity to scoop up this money that was being dangled by the Saudi Public Investment Fund was too good to turn down. I'm sure that the PGA realized that the LIV Tour was doomed to failure just on the basic fundamentals of their project, and that they could win eventually if they continued competing, waited them out, waited for maybe one of these bust cycles that I'm describing, waited for the Saudis to realize that they didn't have as much silly money as they did this year and the year before. But it was easier just to take the money that was on offer. Why continue to fight when, you can just make a deal and take all of the money that was being wasted by the public investment fund?
Yeah, because you don't do that if you have morals based on the way that they originally approached it. But I see what you're saying. So, John, I want to ask you a question here, specifically from the sports washing angle, right? We've touched on some of the criticism that the Saudi Arabian regime gets. A big point of it was the journalist Jamal Khashoggi and how he was murdered. And that's been an issue for years here in the United States. There was documentaries on it. So from a sports washing perspective and how that fits into the PIF and Vision 2030, we're mentioning boom and bust cycles of Saudi Arabia making a ton of money and then not so much money based on the price of commodities, wanting to transition their economy. Is part of this image rehabilitation linked to the desire to get tourism? Is it foreign direct investment? What type of benefits would you say that the Crown Prince and their regime are looking for in the efforts that they're going under to improve their world image?
So, as listeners may or may not know, in the last few years since Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman came into a position of leadership in Saudi Arabia had been going through an enormous social transformation and a real effort to change the way society operates in the country and also how the country is perceived abroad. It's important to note that from 1979 until halfway through the last decade, 2017-ish, Saudi Arabia was a very, very repressive society. Saudi Arabia were governed according to the principles of Wahhabi Islam, which is a very conservative, fundamentalist interpretation of Islam. And this was sparked by violent events that happened in Mecca in the year 1979. This was the period in which Saudi Arabia really entered into a very repressive cultural state. Alcohol was entirely banned everywhere in the country. Women did not have permission to meet men outside their family without the consent of their family members. They did not have the ability to travel freely in the country. It was an incredibly repressive society. There were religious police that would monitor people at malls and make sure that they weren't standing too close to each other. And living in another part of the Arab world, in neighboring United Arab Emirates, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, I knew many businessmen that had to fly back and forth between the two countries, and they would say, going to Saudi Arabia for a week feels like a month. You feel like you're in jail in your hotel room.
John, it sounds like a utopia for the more socially conservative House Freedom Caucus members.
Freedom, it's not a word that you would really use to describe the situation at all. Saudi Arabia, since it was founded in the early 20th century, has only had really two generations of leadership. From the founder of Saudi Arabia, Ibn Saud. For a very long time, all of the leaders were really people from the generation after him, his sons, of which he had many. He had something like 50 or 60 children. And the succession was passing from brother to brother to brother across that generation. Mohammed bin Salman, the current crown prince, who will be, in all likelihood, the next king of Saudi Arabia, is the first person from a different generation ever to come into power really in the country. And we've skipped, it seems, almost 2 or 3 generations of people, jumping from people that were in their 80s and 90s for such a long time to someone who's actually a millennial. We skipped all of the boomers. We've skipped all of the Gen X. We went really right from the silent and greatest generation down to millennials. So since he's come into this position of prominence, he has really tried to instill his own vision for how society should operate, which is not in the fundamentalist, arch religious conservative type system, but instead a system that's much more similar to a place like the United Arab Emirates, where there are relatively broad social freedoms, but still a very autocratic concentration of political power. And I think what a lot of Americans struggle to understand is how political freedom, political liberalism can be so separate from the question of social freedom and social liberalism. And a really good illustration of this is one of the controversies that happened in Saudi Arabia. Prince Mohammed has changed one of the most controversial rules in Saudi Arabia, which was the rule that banned women from driving. Women were not allowed to drive for a couple decades in Saudi Arabia because of this Wahhabi system that I described. So he's changed the rules to allow women to drive, right? However, at the same time, he has imprisoned female activists who campaigned for the right to drive. This is a perfect illustration of this dichotomy between the social freedoms and the political freedoms. He says you are allowed to have the social freedoms, but you have them at my bequest. You don't have them because you have politically campaigned and petitioned for this change. And if you take on that kind of political activism, you will not be able to participate in society. You can have the freedoms that we grant you, but you should not seek to combat the state to push for these kinds of freedoms on your own initiative.
I remember way back when there were articles basically framing MBS as a reformer, as liberal, as almost a great hope here in DC for advancing our values overseas. If there has been a liberalization, again, what's the purpose of improving the image internationally from a real hard perspective? Are they trying to get more investments into the country to advance projects that they're trying to complete by 2030? Is it tourism dollars? Is it simply they want to do kind of what the US does and export their culture overseas? Like what's going on here? Help me understand like the motive, I guess, behind the sports washing that they're being accused of, at least.
Yeah, so I think that you have characterized it pretty accurately, that as part of this plan to diversify the Saudi economy and move away from the concentration on fossil fuels, Saudi Arabia are trying to paint a different picture of the country and to advance industries that had been dormant or ignored as a way to build a sustainable economic future for the country. And that is going to require investment in diverse sectors from the Sovereign Wealth Fund, the PIF, but also some foreign investment. Tourism is a part of that. So Saudi Arabia have always had a tourism industry, but it's been until recently based entirely around Hajj Umrah, the pilgrimages to the religious sites that are based in Saudi Arabia and Mecca in particular. So there's always been a lot of international visitors who come to Saudi Arabia, but you could only visit as a tourist for this particular purpose. You couldn't get a tourist visa for any other purpose until just a few years ago. So now Saudi Arabia are trying to advance other tourist destinations. They have a large Red Sea coastline. The Red Sea is a popular place for scuba diving, for example. Sharm el-Sheikh, the famous scuba diving destination on the Red Sea in Egypt, for example, has been a big tourist destination for a long time. And Saudi, by developing their Red Sea spots, could maybe have a similar type of attraction to natural tourism. They're promoting the Nabataean sites, the historical sites. If anyone is familiar with Petra, the site in Jordan, the ancient Nabataean city that's carved out of sandstone, you will find a similar site in Saudi Arabia that Saudi Arabia are trying to develop as a tourist destination. This is very different from how Saudi Arabia had been thinking about their tourism in the previous era, which was entirely religious. Here they are trying to attract people to visit a site that was built by pagans and Christians rather than one that was a very specific Muslim religious site. You would never see this site promoted in a previous time. This interest in developing these other industries, in attracting foreign investment, and in doing investment in projects like LIV Golf and so on. When Prince Mohammed first came into power, this was something that the United States was very, very excited about, as you kind of referenced. And shortly after his rise to prominence, he was welcomed on a visit to the United States, where he visited Hollywood, where he visited Washington, and where these different industries and interest groups in the United States really rolled out the red carpet for him, welcoming the idea of Saudi investment and the opening of the Saudi economy. For example, Saudi Arabia had no cinemas allowed during the Wahhabist fundamentalist period from 1979 until recently. You could not go to the cinema and watch a movie. Hollywood was frustrated about this because they realized that Saudi Arabia could be a top 10 market for cinema, and it was completely closed up. The idea that Prince Mohammed would open up the cinematic market to imports from the United States and elsewhere was a very enticing one for the Hollywood industry. And in 2018, that's what happened. The cinemas began opening again, and they could be built in malls and so on. So this all really changed because of the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi. It completely shattered the image that Prince Mohammed was trying to build for the country. And all of these other issues became controversial as a consequence of that. For example, the war in Yemen that Saudi Arabia had been prosecuting with some U.S. support and in coalition with other players in the region suddenly started getting a lot more attention and became a lot more controversial in Washington, D.C. Prince Mohammed had become very polarized as a consequence of this assassination. It was really a kind of a before and after moment for his reputation.
Even I, not a big follower of Saudi Arabia, went from, oh, this guy's kind of cool. This might be a good thing to, really not liking him.
And at the same time as Saudi Arabia were continuing to pursue a lot of these social reforms that originally attracted all this positive coverage, everything about Saudi Arabia was suddenly colored by this negative lens. And it's been an enormous issue in the bilateral relationship. I mean, another source of this tension has been the way that Prince Mohammed has been politically polarized, partly because of the enormous and extremely controversial, and if I may say, blatantly corrupt investment that the PIF made in Jared Kushner's startup investment fund, Affinity Partners, a $2 billion investment. And it was reported in American newspapers that the board of the PIF reviewed the investment proposal from Kushner and said that it did not pass commercial muster, that there was clearly not a strong legitimate basis to pursue this investment, and were then overruled by Prince Mohammed, who wanted to put $2 billion into this very politically sensitive project. It certainly has the appearances of some kind of bribe. And it's also, I think, cast a shadow over U.S.-Saudi relations.
I do wonder how much of the decision to buy Jared Kushner came from the conscious realization that, hey, maybe Democrats aren't going to be with us because they kind of care about these things like freedom of press and freedom of expression. So they decided to kind of cozy up to the Republican Party. I guess what would be interesting is, so we've gone through using the PGA-LIV merger as symbolism, foreshadowing, whatever, proxy for just U.S.-Saudi relations currently. What are some of the downsides for the United States when you have such an important player in the region, Saudi Arabia, that is viewed just with outright contempt with, I'm going to throw a number on it, 60-70% of our politicians. And then you have friction with the Biden administration. There's always reports coming out about how bad their relationship is with MBS. Will this blow back on us? Should the United States take a more measured approach, or are things so frayed right now that it's just pedal to the metal? It wouldn't behoove us to kind of reevaluate.
Well, the United States seem to have made a decision that cooperation with Saudi Arabia is important, despite all of the challenges and all of the difficulties and all of the controversies that we've discussed. And I think that this really, again, came out of the escalation in Ukraine. At that point, the United States realized that, or came to the conclusion, I shouldn't say realized, because I don't mean to make an explicit endorsement of this decision, although I think it has a lot of validity to it. But they came to the conclusion that we did not want to give away our any potential friendships. We wanted to keep the friends that we have and not create new enemies at a time when we needed to really rally as much cohesion and support in our partnerships in the response to this enormous security emergency. And there are a number of topics in which the United States and Saudi Arabia do work together and have found that they can refocus the partnership, the United States have become really focused on trying to get Israel, Saudi normalization over the line. I do wonder if the enormous prioritization and focus on this particular issue is perhaps misjudged. I'm not sure if it does have the benefit to U.S. interests that many seem to, but it's clearly something that's very important to the Biden administration, as it was to the previous administration.
And that kind of makes sense, John, because very rarely do foreign policy issues seep into domestic politics vis-a-vis elections, Israel being one of the outliers, right? So you would understand why an administration, even if the benefits were maybe a little bit more murky, would be so obsessed with trying to create positive headlines about Israel.
And another area that obviously does have relevance to U.S. domestic politics are these issues around the energy market. And the U.S. really want to have a voice in Riyadh on energy policy. I think that this got very overheated last year, and the United States were talking about Saudi oil exports as though this is something that the United States could hopefully dictate, and not really thinking about the Saudi perspective, where having the oil price around $80 is so crucial for funding all the investment projects we've been discussing. But certainly the U.S. remembered Saudi Arabia's crucial role in these energy markets, and it became another reason why we didn't want the relationship to continue deteriorating. On the issues that matter but aren't quite as high profile for the United States domestically, we have things like Sudan. The U.S. and Saudi Arabia are working closely together on trying to create ceasefires and dialogues between the warring parties in Sudan, the Sudanese army, and the RSF, the paramilitary group. Saudi Arabia seems to be the partner of choice for the U.S. on this topic, when previously the U.S. worked with other countries, some European partners, other Arab states. It seems like Saudi Arabia are the country that the U.S. are going to be working with as a preferred partner on this issue. There's also, other aid that's going to go to Ukraine on a less high-profile basis, but some financial aid and other humanitarian assistance that Saudi are delivering to Ukraine. There's the Iran security issue. The United States and Saudi Arabia are very close key partners on intelligence and defense cooperation around the Iranian threat, who Saudi Arabia kind of perceive as their major threat. But Saudi Arabia have demonstrated that they are trying to diversify their relationships. It's not just going to be about the United States on everything, but they're also going to work with China on a lot of economic partnerships. They announced that they would reopen their embassies with Iran in a deal that they claim was brokered by the Chinese, which, even if it isn't an enormous game changer in this rivalry that is going to continue between Iran and Saudi Arabia, it will hopefully bring down the temperature. And doing it in a forum that was held by the Chinese did give a message to the United States that Saudi Arabia will work with others. Another example of how Saudi Arabia are sending these messages to the United States that you can't always count on us, we have other people that we're going to continue to talk to, is that in the same week that Tony Blinken, U.S. Secretary of State, visited Riyadh, were hosting Nicolas Maduro, a huge enemy, really, of the United States. I think it's in no uncertain terms, who the United States tried to overthrow in recent years. The Saudis welcomed him at the same time as they were hosting the United States. Another clear message that Saudi Arabia's foreign policy and economic policy would not be dictated from Washington.
Enemy is the perfect term to describe Nicolas Maduro. You know how I quoted Tim Kaine as saying, "Oh, the deal makes me want to vomit," between Saudi Arabia and the PGA Tour. Well, my Republican origins, despite being a Democrat now, just make me want to vomit when I hear about Nicolas Maduro and legitimate socialism in Venezuela, John. But as you're describing all of these areas of cooperation, of potential cooperation, of no cooperation, really, like, for example, Iran with China taking the lead. From my perspective, again, not being an expert on the region, I understand trying to advance values of freedom and trying to partner with countries that only see the world in the way that we see the world. But that's just not realistic in any sense for nation states. It's not realistic for individuals. It seems like a little bit of a warped worldview. And my perspective on this thing is we clearly should have a relationship with Saudi Arabia. And also, I wish that Saudi Arabia didn't buy the PGA Tour. It feels like we almost need to put the public relations campaigns, put Saudi Arabia on the back burner in the American public, leave them out of being a focus of politicians heading into an election. So I hope that we can kind of find a working relationship. It doesn't have to be a beautiful friendship, right? But it seems like we need to take steps forward so that we can then advance our goals on the international stage.
Well, I think that is what the U.S. administration would hope for, that the U.S.-Saudi relationship can get to an even-keeled, predictable understanding where it does not take up quite as much room in the public discourse, but where there's a lower profile level of cooperation that can get the relationship to a healthy place. But that's part of why a big announcement like the one that happened this week might indeed be somewhat counterproductive, because we're seeing, again, Saudi Arabia regaining its prominent position in public discourse and regain its incredibly polarizing, controversial profile. And why, again, as we conclude this conversation, we have to wonder if the money is being spent wisely and strategically. When putting Saudi Arabia, again, at the center of controversy seems, if anything, to backfire on Saudi Arabia's perception and position.